Welcome again to the third edition of Reasons for Believing. I hope you're enjoying the journey so far. Thank you everyone who's commented. One comment was what a tip my study is. Well, not quite in those words. I wish I had a fancy studio for you, but we have to make the best of it, don't we? This is a reason for believing that I'm particularly excited about. I believe in God because Jesus is his Son. When I look at Jesus, that makes me believe in God. You see, I'm convinced that the character of Jesus is not fictional. There's no one anywhere in literature who even begins to compare with him. I know what I'm talking about here because before I went off to God ordained, I got a degree in literature from what I consider to be the finest university in the world. It's very difficult even for someone like Shakespeare or Tolstoy to create a good character who isn't bland. They have to put in faults, warts and all, character failings and foibles. This is because we find it hard to conceive of goodness except as an absence of character flaws. But these same flaws are what make people interesting to us, enable us to identify with them. But Jesus, as written about in the Gospels, is someone who is good all the way through, and yet the most disturbing, commanding, inspiring, and majestic person in all human writing. Bland. Jesus. One very unusual feature of Jesus' character, again as written about in the Gospels, is the way he unites in himself traits that seem to us to be opposites. What I mean is this: a visionary person may not always be the most practical, down-to-earth person that you could meet, whereas that same hands-on person may be contemptuous of those whose heads are in the clouds. A man on a mission may find it hard to be a people-centered person, where someone who's very sensitive to the moods and feelings of others is likely to find it too challenging to push on with their goals in the face of people who disagree with them. A highly charismatic leader will find it difficult to get down to the level of washing others' feet. But a meek and humble person is unlikely even to aspire to be a leader. And let's face it, holy and righteous people are not often prone to seeking out the company of sinners, as Jesus always seems to have done. So how does Jesus manage to unite in himself, in one person, what seem to us such opposites? We all have the weaknesses that go with our strengths, so much so that they may seem to be their necessary counterparts. So if gentleness is our strength, firmness is our weakness. If words are our strength, silence is our weakness. If tasks are our strength, people are our weakness. Yet somehow Jesus manages to combine all of these in one complete and coherent personality, to have just the strengths without their downsides. It's as if he's humanity as we were meant to be, all that is best about us fused into one majestic whole. I wonder if this is what Jesus meant when he referred to himself as the Son of Man. Is he someone who represents everything that we could be, if only we could achieve our full potential? Is he someone, if we look hard enough, where we can see what is best about ourselves? But I want to go beyond even this. Is he more than a very special and unusual person? To argue that I believe in God because Jesus is his Son is to assert that at least some things that are unique about God are also true of Jesus. I don't mean immortality, because Jesus died. I don't mean omnipresence, because he lived at one time and in one place. I don't mean omnipotence and omniscience and all those other big words that theologians apply to God. All of these Jesus appears to have surrendered when he embraced our humanity. He truly became human. He wasn't just playing at it. What do I mean then? Well, I certainly mean the holiness of God. Jesus has a very powerful kind of holiness, which is unlike that of any other so-called holy people. It doesn't consist of cutting himself off from the world, the flesh and the devil, hiding in a cave or up a pillar or shut away in a cell. Instead, Jesus is there for tax collectors, prostitutes. He's there for people in meltdown, sinners, lepers. He doesn't shun their uncleanness to avoid being contaminated by it, but because he embraces those who are enslaved to it, he makes them clean. That's powerful holiness. That's not human holiness, it's a holiness from God, in my view. But I also mean the freedom of God. Jesus has this tremendous ability to be himself and to fulfill his mission no matter what pressures are put upon him. For example, here's one Bible story. It's from Mark, but it comes up in a couple of other Gospels too. Jesus is on his way to rescue the daughter of a pillar of the local community who's begged him to come and heal her because she's dying. But in amidst all of this, a woman in the huge crowd that's gathered round them comes up and touches Jesus. Instantly, Jesus switches his focus to that person who's reached out to him, as though the crowd and the synagogue rulers and the desperate situation and even his own disciples who are pressurizing him to keep going and telling him, come on, how can you say who touched me in the middle of this crowd? Well, he just carries on as if they're not there. Finally, he discovers her, and it's as if he has all the time in the world for just that one person. Totally people-centered, just as he's been totally mission-centered up to that point. He heals her. He affirms her. He knows she needs more than to just get the healing she's reached out for. She needs to be told, she needs to hear that her life is valuable. At last, after all this, he reaches the house of the dying girl, only to find the funeral's already started. He kicks everybody out. Can you even imagine what it takes to disrupt a funeral like this? And I've been a vicar for 35 years or something. I've never had somebody march in and throw everybody out at one of my funerals. Wow. Then, having restored the little girl to life, he calmly tells the completely mind-boggled family to give her something to eat. He's there with the tiny practical details as well. What a man! It really isn't the miracle that's so astonishing here. It's the absolute freedom of Jesus to be himself. The barefaced cheek of him in all that he does. Well, all right, the miracle is a bit astonishing too. But above all, when I assert that Jesus uniquely displays characteristics of God in human form, I mean the love of God. The key insight of Christian spirituality is this: God is love. It's doubtful if this insight could have come about without Jesus. It's a reflection late on in the New Testament as a reflection on what Jesus' life says about who God is. But it carries huge weight with it. If I believe in God because Jesus is his son, then Jesus has to be nothing less than God incarnate. And God incarnate in Christian talk means love incarnate. Can Jesus' life and character stand up to this scrutiny, to be love displayed in human form? Well, to do this, we have to set our parameters for what we mean by love. Most of us would like God to offer us what I call granddad love. give us whatever we want on demand, turn a blind eye to our foibles, make sure everyone gets to heaven, except obviously for those who deserve to burn, like Nazis and paedophiles. I think we know that this sort of love, this sort of God that just hands out sweeties all the time isn't good enough. In the spoiled West, we give him a job description, which is to make sure nothing bad ever happens to anyone. And by and large, we sacked him for sleeping on the job. If he's so cuddly, he's not going to mind anyway when we reject him, is he? So he'll get us to paradise however rude we are to him, won't he? Does it really matter if God is such a dope whether we call on him and put our trust in him or not? But what if the divine love is not like that at all? What if that job description is totally fake? Most Christians in the past, when life was a great deal tougher, and most Christians in many parts of the world, turn to God because they see how very tough, how very difficult life is, and they're looking for something that will enable them to find meaning and purpose in their lives in spite of the difficulties thrown at them. So what if that image of God is an idol? It's a projection of our own consumerist desires, isn't it? You're there to give me what I want, we're saying. Surely anyone who's grown up, anyone who's actually tried to love another human being, or has looked for more than a few minutes at the world around them, knows that Grandad God is pure fantasy. What Jesus gives us instead is the cross. This is love that is so fierce, it will dare any suffering. So powerful, it will overcome every obstacle. So broad that it encompasses everyone without exception, because the cross is for sinners. So uncompromising that it demands absolutely everything. Are you ready for this? This is the real reason why people give up on this stuff. It's too challenging. But here at last is love that is worthy to be linked to the name of God. Love that is deeper, wilder, purer, and more passionate than anything we feel quite comfortable imagining. Again and again, we see this love in the gospel stories of Jesus. Jesus overwhelmed with compassion at the needs of outcasts. Jesus deeply angry with our hardness of heart that cast them out in the first place. Jesus demanding that we leave everything to follow him. Jesus shouting with joy over the tears of the prodigal son. Here at last is the length and the breadth and the height and the depth of the love of God in a form that lives a human life with us. I believe in God because I believe Jesus is his son. But Colin, we expected a proper argument here with facts. This is subjective, it's opinion, it's literary. Where's your hard evidence? Well, there is plenty of hard evidence to look at, and I'm coming to that in a moment, but I just want to say this. Christianity makes emotional sense in Jesus. It tells us that we are loved. It tells us that because of that love we are forgiven. Those are the things we most need to get us through life's challenges. But some evidence. I've got a couple of books here actually. This is one by Simon Sebag Montefiore. You might have seen him on telly. And this is Jerusalem, the biography. And because he's talking about the history of Jerusalem, of course, there's a chapter that talks about Jesus. Because Jesus went to Jerusalem and he played out the great events of his life there, namely his cross and resurrection. And what Simon Sebag Montefiore tells us is that Jesus definitely lived, that he had a great reputation as a teacher and a healer, that huge crowds follow him, that because of that he was a threat to both the civil and religious authorities of the day, and therefore they executed him on a cross, which was the standard form of Roman execution at the time. Another great big book here, Volume 1 of The Story of the Jews. This is by Simon Sharma. Again, I hope you've watched him on television. He's riveting. And he says the same thing when he covers that era. That was only Volume 1, by the way. They're absolutely amazing books if you ever get a chance to read them. He says exactly the same things. Jesus, born in obscurity, a leading teacher and healer, attracting huge crowds, went to Jerusalem, was seen as a threat to the authorities who put him to death on a cross. Pontius Pilate was the governor, as stated in the Christian creeds, and all of those things. So what do these have in common? Well, apart from being leading historians, professionals, as well as just TV people, they know their stuff. They're both secular Jews. They have no axe to grind. They're not Christians trying to plead a special case for their beliefs. They've studied the facts, and they say that the evidence is that we cannot dismiss Jesus as some sort of fairy story. I've heard people say this. You can't get away with it. The evidence is against you as seen by proper historians. It's not fairy stories. The next thing I'd like to call to mind is the letters in the New Testament. These are all written on the basis that Jesus is Lord, that he was crucified, and that he rose again from the third day. And several of these, even the most skeptical scholars, give them early dates, within 25 years of the time that these events happened in Jesus' day, well within living memory. I've got a wonderful book, another great big one up there, Jesus, the Eyewitnesses, and it talks about the people who were still alive when these things were written, and makes an incredible case. That's Professor Richard Balcom. Absolutely worth a read. Coming to the Gospels themselves, one of the things that we have is incredible textual evidence. What happened in those days, there were no printing presses and no internet. Things had to be copied out by hand. The sheer number of copies is amazing. We have more fragments of the New Testament than any other book from ancient history. And we're talking about hundreds of times more, not just a few more. Not all of them are in good condition. Some of them are scraps because it's paper. There are fires, there are accidents that happen to things, there were persecutions, people turned out of their homes, but the urge to keep copying it was there. So these form a very, very good testimony to the authenticity of the works that make up the New Testament. And we keep finding earlier and earlier ones. So back in the Victorian era, we're starting late 18th century, scholars in Germany said, well, all these stories must be myths because people don't perform miracles. They latched on to the sort of God who's remote and distant, the one who comes from deducing the laws of nature. Well, of course, our understanding has changed now with quantum physics. We don't see the laws of nature in the same way that they did. And God is a distant figure who just winds up the universe, puts the laws in, sets it in motion, and leaves it up to us. It would be bad tasting God to come and do miracles, except, of course, that in Jesus, God doesn't care about being tasteless. He comes and embraces humanity in all our mess. So what's eroding that now? What's making that look so out of date is that more and more of these scraps of parchment and papyrus keep turning up and forcing us to look at earlier and earlier dates. But I would also say that the internal evidence supports the early dates for the Gospels. I'm working actually on a project about John the Baptist at the moment. So why is John the Baptist the most named person in the New Testament, in the Gospels, after Jesus? Jesus obviously gets the biggest coverage. Next is not the Virgin Mary, it's not Simon Peter or any of the other apostles, it's John the Baptist. Every Gospel includes a sizable chunk of information about him. And they all say very much the same sort of thing, that John the Baptist came preaching repentance and urging people to be baptized as a sign that they were turning away from their sins. And he went on to say that he was only paving the way for one following after him. All four Gospels say this and go into great length to say it. And they say it in different ways, but it's the same message. So these Gospels, written perhaps in different times and in different places, tell us that the stories about John the Baptist are really important because they are part of a community of people who are still having a lively discussion with the Christian disciples. So some John the Baptist's disciples are saying John is the one we want to follow, and the Christian disciples are saying, if you want to follow John, you must follow Jesus, because that's what John himself taught. And you can see this working out in interesting ways actually in the book of Acts, when there are encounters between John's disciples and Jesus' disciples, and the one or two of them in the Gospels too. Well, what does this show? It shows us something about the dates of the Gospels. All four Gospels were written when there was still a live debate going on between John's disciples and Jesus' disciples. Well, we know Jesus' disciples kept going. They're still with us today. I'm one of them. There are 2.5 billion of us, on conservative estimates, but people who at least in some way own the name of Jesus all around the world. But John's disciples are no more. Doesn't have any more followers. When did there stop being a community of John's disciples who were in discussion with the disciples of Jesus? Well, I'm afraid it looks as though it was very early on. In 70 AD, the Jewish state was attacked by the Romans, who were fed up with their constant rebellions. They burned Jerusalem to the ground. The Jewish people were scattered throughout the known world. And John's focus that had been so much on trying to bring Israel to repentance came to an end. He's mentioned in Josephus, who writes about the destruction of the Jewish state as somebody who existed. That's it. There are many more references in literature and in all the various parchments and things that there are to Jesus after this. There are no more to John. We have apocryphal Gospels. We have cynical people saying, well, the church chose the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in order to suppress the non-canonical, the apocryphal Gospels. You may have read this sort of thing in the papers. It comes up every so often. Yet another attempt to poo-poo the Gospels. John the Baptist isn't named in them. He just disappears completely from view. There's an absolute divide between the apocryphal Gospels and the canonical and historical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the name of that divide is John the Baptist. He's disappeared from the scene. There is no longer any discussion between John's disciples and Jesus' disciples happening there. It's passé. It's distant history. They were written much, much later than our 4 Gospels, for whom John the Baptist is a live issue. Well, you can tell I've got a bee in my bonnet about this, haven't you? That's because I want to write up a thesis on it. I need to stop there. This has already been one of the longer reasons for believing. But what I'd like to do to round off this post is to ask you to read about Jesus for yourself. Try Mark's Gospel. It's the shortest Gospel. It's just 16 brief chapters. You could do it in not too much over an hour. And as you read, just ask yourself a few questions. What kind of person is this Jesus? Is there anyone else in history anything like him? Is there anyone in fiction I've ever read anything like him at all? How could he be so like us? How can he identify so deeply with us and yet be so different from us in certain crucial ways? And ask yourself especially, could this be what love incarnate looks like? Who is this man? I'm utterly convinced by him. But be warned, if you read Mark's Gospel, and if your answer to that last question, is this what love incarnate looks like, is yes, then there are implications for that. Divine love means eternal love. God is not a distant figure, but one who's come into our world and shared it with us. And because divine love is eternal love, that means Jesus is still around. He's real. He'll want to be part of your life. And that won't happen unless you're changed by him, because those are his conditions, I'm afraid. In the end, I believe that Jesus is God's Son because he came into my life and changed it utterly.